Hi, I'm Peter Andresen with Andresen & Associates, and I want to have a pre-quarterly review here. This is September 30th, 2024. It was a great quarter for the S&P 500, and frankly, all of our investments started to make money. It's about time. We had that interest rate cut last week that we've been waiting for. So I wanted to get a little review going before the quarterly review next week to discuss why you own what you own and what purpose do they serve in your portfolio. So let's get started. But right now, it's obvious. We had a great quarter, and the S&P 500 finished today, September 30th, 2024, I'm using notes, at 5,762.48. Awesome. Now, we don't own an entire portfolio of the S&P 500, and that's worth discussing. So I want to review this because it's very important. All the valuation measures are over the top for the S&P 500. They're very much overvalued. Not so much for the rest of the market, but for the S&P 500, it's a bit overvalued. Historically, when those overvaluations occur, there's a lag. An overvaluation statistic is not helpful for timing the stock market. But one of two things happens. Either the stock market goes sideways, which is rare, but it happens, just goes sideways for a while other investments become the center of attention, or the S&P 500 has a correction. So if we had a correction, and I'm not saying one is going to happen because, we've been overvalued for 3 years. But let's say we have one of 25%, which is what we had in 2020. It's what we had in 2022, so 2 years ago. And that takes us down to 4321.86 on the S&P 500. That basically just takes out 2024's gains, except that, remember, we had the down market in 2022. So that takes us back to 2021. So a decline of 25%, which we last had 2 years ago, although it doesn't feel like it, would take us back 3 years. To recover from that will take a 34% gain. You'll have to make a third of your money again because, remember, percentages when you're small are smaller. Each percentage is smaller than when you're higher or bigger. Now, the last time we had a 50% stock market decline was 2008. It was also coincidentally the last time we've seen valuations like this. Although, if something like 2008 happens, it's going to come out of the sun from something different because the mortgage excesses aren't there. But anyway, let's say we have a decline of 50% in the S&P 500. 50% of 5762 is 2881, and that takes us to 2016 values. That takes us back 8 years. And again, you don't think it's going to happen? Well, the big investment houses, the good ones that I respect, like Vanguard, can see it coming. They can't tell when. They're saying that we'll be lucky if the S&P 500 keeps up with inflation over the next decade. Now, mind you, they're not saying that about small stocks, and they're not saying that about internationals. And also they've been wrong for the last 3 years, just like the valuation statistics. So let's see what's going to happen. Mr. Imperturbable, the Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett, is also selling stocks in Berkshire Hathaway. I have no idea what that does to the tea in China, but anyway, he's selling stock and going to cash as well. Now, we don't own a lot of stock in the S&P 500. Our portfolio percentage in the S&P 500 is actually relatively mild for the most part. Some clients have more. But this is why, because of that overvaluation, the S&P 500 is a marvelous thing. It's just gotten a little ahead of itself. What are we going to do about it? Basically, we're not, because we've been wrong for the last 3 years, we're not going to rebalance our S&P 500 holdings. We're just going to let them get a little bloated and accept that that's going to add risk to our portfolios. The other thing is we have been purchasing international and small stock positions, and in the third quarter, those began to move. Thank you very much. But the big thing is our bond holdings, and that's something we really want to look at. Again, I'm going to cover this again next week in greater detail, but the bond holdings are interesting because they're there for a reason. They're not just there accidentally. Remember about 3 or 4 years ago when if you had cash, it made nothing? Well, SNVXX, our cash holding, is making, it made about 5% in the last week when the Federal Reserve lowered the interest rates. Now it's down to about 4.5. But holding cash is no longer a zero-sum game here. In the bond holdings, remember when interest rates went up, bonds crashed. It was horrific. 2022 represented some of the worst damages to balanced, to mixed, to diversified portfolios I've ever seen. But the flip side is also true, and that is that when interest rates go down, bonds tend to go up. They actually make capital gains more than their interest rates. We were buying in when the long bonds were yielding about 5%. That's starting to pay off because as interest rates go down, the price of bonds goes up. Now, the longer the maturity, the more they go up, and that's why we have those longer maturity bonds. Now, when stock markets go down, if they go down for any reason, safe bonds, that is treasuries, junk doesn't do that well, although they does make a lot of income, but treasuries tend to go up a lot, as much as gold. So our bond holdings are there as a large hedge that's producing 4 to 5% while we wait for something to happen. So if the stock market were inclined to decline, not small stocks perhaps, not internationals so much, but internationals and the tech, they go down, bonds go up. That movement has started to happen. And when there is a recession, a classic recession, not stagflation, but a recession caused by a decline in economic activity, bonds go up as the stocks go down. And small stocks and internationals are not immune to that, unfortunately. But we have hedged our portfolios against outsized losses. So a 50% decline in the stock market may actually be a classic buying opportunity and make money in our portfolios. That's why those long bonds are there. Now, again, we got in at a 5% cash flow roughly, and so that helps while we're waiting for something to happen. If nothing happens, if it just goes sideways, that 5% keeps cranking up. And if inflation is the benchmark by which we're going to measure the S&P over the next decade, that's actually beating the S&P. Not yet. I want to emphasize something big, and that is that we do not know what will happen. The S&P 500 may just keep going up. If so, that would be an all-time newsworthy event. It would be new. But I noticed that people are blindly indexing a lot these days, so valuation no longer matters as much. The question is that because it's just going to get more and more and more and more overvalued and then topple big as everyone moves like a giant herd of elephants trying to fit on an elevator over into small stocks or internationals? I don't know. That sort of thing has happened before. Also, people correctly assume, given the way the Fed has reacted since 2008, that this little kerfluffle with higher interest rates and inflation is going to pass us by. We'll go back to zero inflation. Good luck with that. And the Fed will rescue us whenever the stock market drops. Therefore, to them, to those investors, the S&P 500 is a risk-free investment. They've been trained by the Fed. We call it the Fed put, and they may be right. Not historically. Now, the other thing is that whoever wins the election, both parties have espoused deficit spending, building deficits, spending as far as the eye can see. So the party is probably going to roll on until it can't. Thus, the S&P 500 may not go down. If any of those three things don't happen, then the S&P 500 is due for a correction. We don't know. I'm not doing a lot of timing, except I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Now, one consequence of this is that I am not rebalancing our S&P 500 holdings. I'm just going to let them get bloated, accept the extra risk, and ride on. So if that is an issue, please connect with me. I want to share this little thing with you. Well, one last little comment. I've been talking this whole time about how valuation measures are at all-time highs. So, well, they're not. They're close to all-time highs. The S&P 500 is very overpriced, and it's been overpriced for years. And so finally, I got fed up, and I took $30,000 of my own money, not your money, my money, and I put it into inverse ETFs. In other words, ETFs that short the S&P 500. Now, at the time, the greatest geniuses in the world were telling me that there must be, and I've quoted those geniuses a lot, there must be a correction soon and yet we know historically that these valuation measures actually kind of suck at timing. But anyway, $30,000 into these inverse ETFs, and guess what? As of September 30th, 2024, 1 month into this experiment, I am down 9%. So that's why we don't do that. And I have a bigger position in those longer term treasuries just like you do, and those have made money, so I'm fine. But it's a lesson. We can see it coming, but we can't tell when. So with that in mind, we can see that the heat wave this week is coming. First real heat wave I think we've had this year, as far as I can remember. It's 87 degrees, and the people of Salinas, California are acting like a meteor's hitting the earth. I even got a heat advisory. Anyway, stay cool, and blessings.